Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Ryan Lee. I hope you are staying safe amongst the pandemic, and we have got a wonderful show planned out, including some of the latest in terms of some pro day updates, including when some schools are having their pro days and who could be some of the top prospects we could be seeing amongst that. And we have got a little bit of a different subject that I have planned out. It is that time of the year. It is March. It is going to create some madness. Yes, I'm going to be going into March Madness, but I'm actually doing a little bit of a different segment. I'm going to be comparing March Madness versus the CFP and where the costs and benefits are to each of those respective tournaments. So let's get right into it. We're going to start off with a subject that is very prevalent, especially considering the times we're in right now with the NCAA Pro Days. Now, I've mentioned this topic several times throughout the last several weeks, and I've done it for a reason, and it's simply put, these prospects are coming out. A lot of them have had complications going on with their season, especially due to the whole pandemic situation. And with that being said, these pro days are actually a lot more important than they probably have ever been. A lot of times when pro days happen, it's just another opportunity to show what you've got. In a normal year, when players would have pro days, it would just be an extra opportunity to show these scouts, show these coaches, GMs, whomever, why you're worthy of a draft pick. Or in some cases, why you're worthy of a contract if you don't get drafted as an undrafted rookie. You're showing these coaches, you're showing these scouts, these GMs, why you're worth it. What makes you special? What makes you worthy of being part of this coach's team or this specific team, this franchise? Now, with the year that we have now, I have discussed previously some of the challenges going on with scouting now. Whether if it's some schools just having to flat out cancel their season, so therefore there's absolutely no tape on a certain player. In some cases, it is the year got cut short, so the same thing applies there. There's not nearly as much tape available for a player. Or what it is that you don't really get a chance to see maybe a combine or maybe some sort of complete version of a conference championship, because a lot of these players, they kind of rely on a lot of that, not only to win their respective championships for their school, but also to have the ability to have another opportunity. Because at the end of the day, wherever you are, especially if you're about to go into the draft process, your gold and what you're worth is footage. In any sort of interaction with these coaches and with these GMs. This has been one of the strangest years we've ever had, for obvious reasons. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that there hasn't been a typical offseason. There hasn't been a typical season itself. so many schools didn't even have a season. A lot of players chose to opt out. One of them is one of the top draft prospects in Penei Sewell. He opted out of Oregon's season. He is still regarded as one of the best prospects in the draft, especially for an offensive lineman, sure. But maybe he could have secured it and ensured it if he opted into the season and played those couple of games for Oregon. Or maybe someone like Trey Lance. He went to North Dakota State. He only had one game in the books. One game. That's it. For that 2020-2021 season. So what these scouts essentially only have to rely on is their intuition and what they can see from these workouts. Now, in this coming week, there's going to be a lot of pro days coming up. And with a lot of pro days doesn't just come a lot of players, but a lot of top players considering where these programs are from. Whether if it's quarterback prospects, skill player prospects, defensive prospects, O-line, it doesn't really matter. Because regardless of which program you're in, regardless of where you went to school or are currently going to school for last semester, that day is becoming more important than ever. And when you consider how these programs have had to adapt to everything going on, essentially everything that they're doing and essentially everything that they have to adjust to and the way they adjust to it is becoming ever so more important. Now, in some of those situations, it might be seen as not the biggest deal. Or in some of those cases, they could do without it because they've had their full season, or at least as full of a season as they can have. I believe in a normal season, we'd have somewhere in the ballpark of 15 to 16 games, and we did get that. However, who did Alabama win to in this last year's championship? Ohio State. Ohio State only went 7-1. They only had a chance to play 8 games the entire year. So that means some of those prospects have only had almost half the number of games as the guys in, let's say, Alabama. They went 13-0 throughout the entire year. In a normal year, if I'm not mistaken, they have less games than previous years. Let's just take LSU, for example. They eventually would go 15-0. So you might say, hey, 2 games is not really big of a deal. It is, especially when you consider how many of those LSU Tigers got drafted. And not just drafted, but got drafted high. And part of it was because they weren't just so dominant throughout the season, and they had so many NFL-ready talent, but also because of the fact that they got a full evaluation of their scouting. Every single individual player on LSU got a full look into how good they actually are. A team like Alabama this year, they won 13-0, sure. But they're not going to get the same amount of valuation that LSU got 2 years ago. They're not going to get the same amount of recognition or the same number of players in the NFL than what LSU did a couple years ago or Clemson did the year before that. None of them are. And Ohio State, even less so. Or a team like Oregon or USC or anything like that. Any of those Big Ten schools. Any of those Pac-12 schools. Mountain West. they're going to get even less recognition, even less observation. So these pro days are the most valuable they've probably ever been, because in some cases you can make up for not having the most college recognition because of the school you went to by going to the combine and going absolute lights out. Let me go through some of the top performers in the combine. And let me just go through some of those schools that those players went to. Chris Johnson went to East Carolina before breaking the 40-yard dash record. I've never even paid any sort of attention to East Carolina whatsoever. John Ross broke that record and went to Washington. That's a Pac-12 school. When they play, most people are asleep because it's a, let's say, 7 o'clock kickoff over there. That's 10 o'clock in the East. And a lot of these media capitals in New York and in Miami and some of the other big sports powerhouses like Boston, Pittsburgh, they're borderline asleep by then. They know nothing about Washington. DK Metcalf went to Ole Miss. And to be fair, Ole Miss has had some good history, but not that year. And he was also overshadowed by another receiver on Ole Miss, A.J. Brown. Byron Jones, if I'm not mistaken, he has the record for the longest broad jump. He went to a basketball school in UConn. Went to a basketball school. So this is why having these pro days the way they are now, it's just that much more valuable, especially in the climate we're in now. Scouting's different. Evaluation's different. And especially in a league where everything is so subjective. There's a reason why they focus so much on film study in the NFL. It's because in film study, you get the big picture. Numbers don't tell you anything. Jameis Winston, for example, has led the league in passing yards. But that was the same year he went 30 touchdowns for 30 interceptions. He ended his year in Tampa that year with a pick six. The 30th interception. You can say, for example, Drew Brees over the last several years, you can look at the accuracy numbers. However, especially in the last 3 years where Drew Brees' arm kind of regressed, why has his accuracy percentage been so high? Because he runs a lot of short routes. A lot of slants, a lot of drag routes, some corners maybe. You get a lot of those short, easy completion routes, those high completion, low risk routes. And everything after that is yards after catch. He's surgical in the way he places the ball and puts it in a place where a receiver can continue to run down the field and get more yards after the catch. Brees got hammered this past year because his deep ball throwing ability, the arm power, the arm strength just was not the same. So you kind of need to look at that footage, look at that film to see why things are the way they are. You could look at, for example, Sam Darnold's numbers and say, look, this guy's been significantly regressing. It's not because he's been regressing. His game is still there. The thing is that the offensive line's been getting worse, the receiving weapon's been worse, and his coaching's been horrendous. And now he gets Robert Saleh, and what does he get? He gets more pass catchers. He gets a little more of an O-line, a little bit of something on defense with a defensive head coach who led a Super Bowl leading defense, which in that year, San Francisco was actually one of the top defenses in the entire league. And essentially saying, hey, Sam, you don't need to score 35 to win the game. We're not going to force you in a shootout every game. We're going to give you more weapons to work with. especially in a game like yours where you're a little more mobile, a little more around the place, a little more scrambly. Give you some big targets, a Corey Davis here, and then we'll give you some defensive reinforcements so that we can make it manageable. A Sheldon Rankins here. A couple of those guys. The Jets might have overpaid, yes. But at the same time, Robert Saleh can coach a defense where those games are manageable now. They don't get out of reach right out of the gate. Or you get a guy like Josh Allen. I use this example a lot because I know it very well. He's inaccurate in college. He has a huge arm, but not a lot of accuracy. But you look at the tape and what do you see? Oh, his mechanics are a little off. And what does Jordan Palmer spend the entire summer doing? Oh, they use this technology they use in golf to look at a player's swing, and they put it on Josh Allen to analyze his throwing motion. And they're like, oh, look, all of these mini things are throwing off his entire throwing motion. And that's why the ball's going all over the place. Add a Stephon Diggs on top of it, all of a sudden he's top 3 in MVP voting. So you can't really go to the numbers the same way you can in a sport like, let's say, baseball or track and field or swimming, where the numbers don't lie. You're in a racing sport, the numbers don't lie. You have to look at the numbers to see where you're at. Football is one of those subjective sports. You have to look at the context around what's going on, whether it's in the college level or in the NFL. Because this whole scouting game is getting flipped on its head right now. And we don't necessarily know how it's going to look. When you have those footage sports, those subjective sports, that footage is everything. And when you don't get it, there's only one place to get it. And right now, the one place to get it is on the pro day. There's no combine, so a lot of these players are running combine drills at the pro days. There was some footage leaked of Justin Fields. He was practicing the 40 at some random field. He went a 4.4. There have been a lot of footage of a lot of players who have been practicing their combine drills. A lot of footage of some players just working on their craft, I guess, for lack of a better term. Trying to build up their bench press to show their push-off strength. We're going to see a lot of it this next coming week. The 23rd has Alabama. I expect a lot of footage to be coming out that weekend. Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, Najee Harris, Mac Jones. I know they got several guys on the defense and several guys on the offensive line. I expect them all to be having some sort of footage come out. Penn State's on the 25th. A lot of offensive linemen, a lot of defensive linemen. Penn State's a very great team in terms of developing that front seven. BYU is on the 26th. That's all on Zach Wilson. All eyes are going to be on Zach Wilson that day. And believe me, mine are going to be too. And the same thing with Michigan on the same day. It's going to be a lot of offensive and defensive linemen, just like Penn State. We're going to be seeing a lot of pro days coming up. And of course, next week I'm going to review some of that footage, but the scouting game has been changed, at least for the foreseeable future. And depending on how these go and how they play out, will not only determine how the scouting game gets changed in the short term, but will carry on the long term as well. That's all I had on that, and we're going to be going into a quick break, and right after that, we are going to be going into my discussion on the CFP versus March Madness. That's all coming up right after this.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Ryan Lee back here once again for another segment, and we just finished talking about some of the issues revolving scouting, the importance of the pro days this year, as well as the upcoming pro days coming up within the week. Now, I have a very different subject for this week, and it is one that I do not expectedly decide to come up with in the moment. However, with a lot of the stuff that's been going around, especially considering the sports landscape, the time of the year we're in right now, so on and so forth, I actually came up with this idea to actually do a little bit of a pros and cons, compare and contrast type of thing. And the reason why I did it is because it's the start of March Madness. Yes, the big dance, as they call it, is here. The top 68, or in some cases, just a whole bunch of bracketology, is all back here upon us in this time in March. Now, we weren't able to get a season last year due to obvious reasons that I have noted prior. But the reason why I mention any of it is because of the fact that I was watching a couple of games over the weekend. You know, the first four into the first round. And part of me got me thinking about the excitement that revolves around March. You know, you have all of these upsets. They've been coming in. A lot of these top teams have just been absolutely falling left and right. You have millions upon millions of brackets, 95% of which, or I think upwards of 99 to 98% of which were busted within the first day. And literally, it got me thinking about how beautiful March Madness and that tournament really is. Because it is actually insane how important to pop culture and sports culture this tournament essentially is. The way that I see it is that you're not a sports fan. And by a sports fan, I don't mean a fan of a specific sport. By a sports fan, I mean a fan of just the overall industry that is sports. There's a difference there. You can be a Lakers fan but not be a sports fan. You can be a hockey fan without being a sports fan. But you can be a sports fan by being a Lakers fan. And you can be a sports fan by being like a baseball fan, if that makes sense. You can be a fan of one sport, of one team, but it doesn't necessarily make you a fan of the entirety of sports in general. But you can be a fan of sports in general and have your favorite teams. And the reason why I'm going off of that is because I'm not specifically a Buffalo Bills fan, a Buffalo Sabres fan. I'm not specifically a fan of a certain team. But I am, however, a fan of sports whose favorite teams happen to be the Bills and the Sabres. Once again, coming from Buffalo. Born and raised in that 716. There's a difference between the two. Now, I like to consider myself more of an overall sports fan who just happens to have my favorites. Because let's be real here, everyone has favorites. And, of course, with being a sports fan, you kind of learn to appreciate and understand at least something about other sports. Even some of the craziest sports in the world, I can at least appreciate and know a little something about. Even a sport as obscure as curling. I know a good amount about curling, actually. And I'll see occasional highlights on my Instagram feed because I follow TSN, which is essentially the ESPN of Canada. And I'll look at the curling footage and I'll be like, what a shot. Or I'll look at something obscure like, I've mentioned this example a million times, but Olympic swimming. Who pays attention to Olympic swimming? Well, I do. I'm a fan of a lot of Olympic sports. I talk a lot about the NHL. Not a lot of people even know what hockey is. I still haven't even brought up the whole National Hockey League's new TV brand deal with ESPN yet, and how big that is going to be for the sport of hockey, because for me personally, I just grew up with that sport. I bring up a hockey team, 95% of people just look at me with a big question mark on their face, and I can basically do an entire game from start to finish. Several games from start to finish, actually. I've done that before. But the reason why I mention this is because in order to be more of that general umbrella of sports fan, you have to at least know a little bit about every sport. You have to at least, know what a touchdown is. Or you have to at least know the difference between the 2-pointer and the 3-point line. You have to at least know what a goal is in 90% of sports that involve some sort of object in a net. Understanding things like bases loaded or photo finish. They're not just generic terms, they're overall sports terms. Now, I'm kind of getting on a bit of a tangent here, but the reason why I mention all this is because I am a sports fan. I am not a fan of just the NFL. I am not just a fan of football. I've mentioned hockey a million times. I've mentioned Olympic swimming a million times. I've mentioned basketball a lot too. And the reason why I have is because I like to use those other analogies kind of to give a comparison sake. You can't compare GOATs without talking Brady, but also you can't say it without saying Michael Jordan or Gretzky. You can't talk about dominant defensive players without talking about Dennis Rodman or Shaq or even Dominic Hasek. Can't talk about it without saying Reggie White. And the reason why I mention all of this is because those names didn't just come out of thin air. Nobody one day was just like, oh my God, you see this crazy guy? This guy is absolutely dominating the NFL on the defensive line. What's his name? Oh, his name is Bruce Smith. Oh, his name is Reggie White. Who's that? Or, especially now with the way that the pro games are right now, a lot of these players get exposed into the spotlight in college first. So the reason why so many people knew who Peyton Manning was when he was still a volunteer, it's the reason why people knew who Andrew Luck was when he was still in Stanford. It's the reason why people knew of the famous national championship between Georgetown and UNC, because you had two of the biggest names in that game in college who ended up becoming two Hall of Famers. It was Michael Jordan versus Patrick Ewing. Two Hall of Fame players. They got their name through the college system. A lot of the names that are getting thrown out right now, they're going to be very popular in the near future. Are guys like Trevor Lawrence. He's going to be very popular in the near future. You probably are going to get guys like Travis Etienne or Najee Harris who become very popular. Devontae Smith, they're going to be very popular in the next several weeks to months in the professional system. But the reason why they became so popular in the first place is because they got that immediate exposure in college. You know that 95% of the population didn't know who Stephen Curry was until the big dance? The NCAA tournament turned Curry into a household name. And now he's a 2-time MVP, 3-time champion. What more can I say about Steph Curry? Some of the most important moments in the big dance include a lot of current NBA stars. You see, some of the most famous buzzer beaters in the entire NCAA tournament from guys who are currently stars in the NBA or who are very popular in the NBA. You had guys like Kemba Walker, who essentially had to carry UConn on his back. If I'm not mistaken, Gordon Hayward has been part of one of the most important moments in the NCAA tournament. Zion Williamson destroyed everyone last year and elevated his name even higher during the tournament. And I can make a strong argument that honestly, March Madness has a greater impact on its sport than it does the CFP, the College Football Playoff. Now, the reason why I mention this is because I've been watching a lot of basketball lately. The tournament's been on all weekend. I've been kind of a hermit, haven't really left my house too much except to get some food. Worked out in my house. I've eaten in my house. And if I don't, I usually am watching at least a game on my phone. Or I'm listening to it in my car. It's that season. Even in high school, when we would do an independent project in class, my teachers would be nice enough to throw on a game on the big screen. And I wouldn't even do my work. I just watched the game on the big screen and just leave my work to do at home. A lot of my, best sports watching memories that haven't been in real time have been with my dad or with my brother watching March Madness. And I think part of the reason why March Madness, just that name is so synonymous to sports culture, is because of how big it's become culturally. You cannot say March Madness without even the person who knows nothing about basketball. They're going to fill out a bracket. You got 68 teams in the mix. 68 teams. The College Football Playoff, you get 4. And essentially what it is that if you win your respective conference, you get an automatic bid to the big dance. If you do that in the CFP, you better have had an undefeated season. In the CFP, winning your conference doesn't mean anything. Look at the ACC championship. Clemson steamrolled Notre Dame, and Notre Dame still got in at the 4 seed. Yes, there are at-large bids where a lot of times the second, sometimes third-place team in the conference can squeak their way in if they had a good enough record. But winning your conference guarantees you a spot at the tournament. And then from there, you work out the seedings. And because you have a lot of conferences, you have a lot of really good second-place teams, you get a lot of these colleges I personally have never even heard of. A lot of schools where the chance of repeating is just so difficult. because of not only the unpredictability factor, but also you could have a team that either lost the conference finals, win, or you could get a team that got eliminated in their first game of the year, first game of the tournament, and then come back and be champions. Like, for example, let me roll through the last 5 champions of March Madness. And let me roll through the last 5 champions of the college football playoff. And not only did I see who the winner was, but I also looked at how well they performed the year before. Let's start the college football playoff because these ones are really straightforward. I included 2020, this past season, where Alabama won. However, the year before, they won the Citrus Bowl, and they were actually the number 8 team in the country. So Bama was really high up there and continued to stay high up there. LSU last year, they were number 6 the year before, and they won the Fiesta Bowl. Once again, same as Alabama. They won it all, but they were right there as well. And then you get into some of these other teams. Clemson won in 2018, but they lost the semifinals the year before. Alabama, they won, but they bounced back after losing the final. And then Clemson the year before again. They also lost in the finals the year before. So let's go through those winners. It's Alabama, LSU, Clemson, Alabama, Clemson. I see two repeat winners or 2 multi-time winners in the last 5 years. And 3 of them were in the semifinals the year before. It shows the lack of parity in the NCAA college football playoffs. The lack of parity is extremely evident. You have the best coach, you have the best recruitment, and if you have the best recruitment, you have the best team. That is it. You have one really good coach, you have one really good quarterback, you just have a really good scheme, you recruit all the best players, you have success, you win, and then you ship only a small portion of your student athletes out, and then you bring in the next class to bring them in. The juniors step up, become seniors, they dominate again. That is how the college football playoff system works. That is why so few teams have a shot, like a legitimate shot. The only team that really changes, maybe 2 to 3 every single year, actually stay the same. Maybe 1 or 2 actually differentiate every year in the Final Four. Now let's compare that to March Madness. Now, I don't want you to pay close attention to 2 things. Not only what was the result of the year before, but in some cases, who they lost to. This time, we'll go the same order. So in 2019, because there was no tournament in 2020, you had Virginia. The year before, they lost the very first round to the number 16 seed UMBC. Everyone remembers this game. It was the first time ever a number 16 seed beat a number 1 in the first round. When UMBC beat Virginia. And then they bounced back and won the tournament the next year. Villanova won in 2018. What happened? They lost to a number 8 seed in Wisconsin the year before. And they lost in the round of 32. North Carolina. They lost the finals in 2016, bounced back and win the finals in 17. Villanova again. However, they win in 2016, but in 2015, they lose in the round of 32 to North Carolina State. And then you had Duke in 2015. They had to bounce back after losing the first round to number 14 seeded Mercer. So let's go through that. Every single one of those teams lost the year before, but a lot of them won. A lot of them lost, got knocked out of the tournament at really random places in the tournament. The round of 64, the round of 64, the round of 32, the Sweet 16. You can lose anywhere. And listen to some of these teams. Mercer, NC State, UMBC. Like, who are half of those schools? But that's also the beauty of it. you've never heard of half of these schools. And because all you need in March Madness is one hot hand to essentially win you the game. Because of the fact there's 68 teams in the mix, you get a lot of chances for these small schools to really make a run. And because of that, you do get a lot of upsets along the way. I'm actually recording this at a really weird time. I usually record it around Friday night because I was so invested in the NCAA March Madness tournament and I knew I wanted to use it in the planning of the show. I decided to hold it off until Sunday afternoon. So as I'm currently recording this, it's Sunday afternoon. I originally recorded it Friday night. Now the reason why is because I knew something in my gut told me the next 2 days with the basketball games are going to be super important. And I was right. Out of 32 games, 9 of them led in upsets. If I include the 33rd game, the one that I held off to watch this afternoon, 33 games in, 10 upsets. There is an upset 1 in every 3 games so far in this tournament. Let me go through some of these teams and tell me if you're familiar with any of them. So then you get Virginia, who was the reigning champion by technicality. They were a 4 seed this year in their region. They lost to a number 13 seed in the University of Ohio, the Bobcats. And then you had Ohio State. They were this dominant 2 seed. They lost to a school called Oral Roberts. Oral, O-R-A-L, Roberts, R-O-B-E-R-T-S. I've never even heard of Oral Roberts. Syracuse has been a long-time powerhouse in basketball, but they were an 11 seed this year. And they beat San Diego State. Oregon State, the same thing. They've had some time in the NCAA tournament. They've had many appearances, but they were 12 seed this year, and they beat the 5th seed of Tennessee. Rutgers beat Clemson. That was a 10 seed beating a 7 seed. And that was actually the same thing that happened to Maryland, who beat Connecticut. UConn's a powerhouse of a school in the overall realm of basketball. And they lost to Maryland. And then I'm going to get into a couple more schools that I've never even heard of until this tournament. Purdue, a number 4 seed, lost to a 13 seed that I've never heard of, North Texas. Their school name is called the Mean Green. They're literally called the North Texas Mean Green. It's like how University of Marshall calls themselves the Herd. North Texas Mean Green. I've never even heard of them until Saturday night. Friday night. And then Texas. The Longhorns. Horns up. They were a 3 seed this year. They lost to a 14 seed. Can anyone tell me who Avalon Christian is? Can anyone tell me who Avalon Christian is? I've never heard of them. But I'm so intrigued by who they are. Because they are in it. For lack of a better term. And then I stayed and waited because I wanted to put on for this one specific game that was coming up. Loyola Chicago versus Illinois. Loyola Chicago, for anyone who remembers anything about the tournament, I want to say 3 years ago, and Sister Jean and Loyola Chicago actually just upset number 1 ranked Illinois. Now, up until 3 years ago, I've never even heard of Loyola Chicago. But the thing is that a lot of these small schools have nothing but potential for these crazy upsets. And it's so fulfilling to see some of these small schools, the little guys, make it to the big dance. It's literally called the big dance, and I just listed maybe a dozen of the little guys, and that doesn't even include some of those other schools that I've never even heard of. There's so many other schools that myself or probably the general public have never even heard of, they didn't even mention. But that's not the point. The point is that any of these schools have that opportunity to make it in this tournament. And not just make it, but make it far. And any of those top dogs 100% have the opportunity to just not excel. You know, Duke didn't even make the tournament this year. They're often regarded as some of the top basketball schools in the entire country. If I'm not mistaken, Kentucky didn't either. Those schools didn't make it. And they're largely seen as these powerhouse schools, those top schools in the entire country. You know, the Kentuckys, the UNCs, the Dukes. They're seen as those top tier programs. And they didn't even make it into the tournament this year. UNC did make it, but they didn't really perform. But Kentucky, Duke, didn't even make it this year. It shows the craziness that is March Madness. It's literally madness. Do you know how many of those upsets, not this year, but in past years, have come from buzzer beaters? I didn't even get into the buzzer beaters. The number of times you just see a random half-court shot just heaved into the heavens, the prayer that actually go in. You can throw a prayer in football. You can throw that Hail Mary, get 2 seconds left on the clock, you're down by 6. It's a touchdown to win it all. It never works out. The percentage is insanely low. And then you do it in the NCAA. You go from half court. You just launch it in. You hope for a prayer, and it goes in, and it's the game-winning shot. I'll never forget the scene in 2016, I believe it was, where Villanova won on a buzzer beater versus North Carolina. And then the entire coaching staff and a whole bunch of the media members and a couple of the Nova student section stormed the court. Storming the court. In a pre-pandemic world, storming the court. It's also really cool to see in March Madness. You don't really see this as much in the CFP, because in the CFP, it's driven by the stars. Do you have those top guys on your team? Do you have the top guy in each position? Because what it is that top person better perform. So, for example, in the playoff, Justin Fields, he performed. Mac Jones, he really performed. Ian Book did not perform. But when it comes to the madness, you can have this bench player. It's probably his last ever NCAA game. Coach just wants to be, nice, give him a good send-off, give him some minutes in the big dance because it's their first appearance in like 30 years. And that guy can light up 30. And all that adrenaline. That do-or-die situation. What it does is that it instills hope in not just a person, but a whole team. Momentum shifts so quickly. The swings are insane. You can be down 15, all of a sudden be up 5. In a matter of 7 minutes. All it takes is an and one to gain momentum back. All it takes is a 3, a monstrous dunk. You're in a scoring drought. One basket is all it takes for them to just all of a sudden go on a run. And you can have that unknown player, could be that bench guy who's hasn't really had his big shot all his career. It could take all that adrenaline, all that excitement of getting the game. he drops 30, it makes up more than half the team's points and they go on to win. The excitement of a team making school history, program history. It's so exciting. And don't forget, a lot of these teams, it's just so much random craziness. Like, I was reviewing some of the footage from those games. Part of the reason why Ohio State lost to Oral Roberts is because Oral Roberts, they were shooting fire. Oral Roberts just could not miss the basket. And they were riding on momentum. They were riding on emotion. And that emotionality, the randomness, the craziness, just the excitement of watching the little guy win, that David versus Goliath story of a 15 seed beating a 2 seed, or UMBC, a 16 seed, being the number 1 Virginia, the favorite to win the whole tournament. That's exciting. The CFP, it's so difficult to get a lot of that. Because a lot of those guys, yeah, they're bummed out that they didn't necessarily win the championship, but they know they got the draft coming up. A lot of these guys, they are most likely than not playing the final basketball game of their careers. So the adrenaline is through the roof. The pressure is through the roof. A lot of the guys who make it in this tournament, they're going to be playing their final basketball game ever. In the CFP, you do not get that. They know that if they lose, in some cases, yes, it's their last game ever, but for a lot of those starters, it's on to the draft. So the stakes are not as high. All it takes is one person to elevate one team to lift and change an entire tournament, to change an entire month, as well as a school's legacy. That's been it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, listening. Make sure to give us the thumbs up, the 5 stars, all of the positive reviews. Make sure to write us a comment. We really appreciate it, as well as subscribe for more. We're going to be talking a little bit more about some of those updated pro days next week. We'll have to see. But thank you so much for tuning in and listening. Make sure to follow us and find us on all your favorite social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We really appreciate it. Make sure to come back here next week. And for all of us here at the GSMC Podcast Network, this has been the GSMC College Football Podcast. My name is Ryan Lee. Have a great rest of your night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.